Coffee? Not for you, Lorraine sneered, sliding past seat 2A as if Amy didn't exist. Passengers pretended not to notice, sipping champagne, unaware that the black woman they dismissed as invisible was the CEO of a billion-dollar company, and she was about to ground their flight with a single command. This isn't just a story about poor customer service. It's the story of how one woman's defiant stand at 30,000 FT caused an entire system to fracture, exposing a web of deceit that went far beyond a single bigoted act and unleashed a storm of karma so precise it would change lives forever. The polished chrome and hushed tones of the first-class cabin on Transcontinental Airlines, Flight 417 from Denver to New York, were designed to soothe for the titans of industry, the quiet celebrities and the old money heirs who usually filled these plush, oversized seats. It was a familiar sanctuary, a sterile bubble that insulated them from the chaos of travel. On this crisp Tuesday morning, Dr. Amy Thornton settled into seat 2A. She was by any measure more successful than nearly everyone else on the plane. At 38, she was the founder and CEO of Origin Innovations, a company at the forefront of developing AI-driven sustainable agriculture solutions. Her work was literally changing how the world fed itself. She had graced the covers of Forbes and Wired, delivered keynote addresses at Davos, and held patents that were reshaping an entire global industry. Her net worth was a figure that required a calculator and a comfortable chair. Yet to the senior flight attendant working the first-class cabin, Lorraine Walsh, Amy was apparently invisible. Amy noticed it first as a subtle atmospheric shift. Lorraine, a woman in her late 50s, with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, moved through the cabin with a practiced, almost theatrical grace. She offered pre-aperture champagne to the man in 1C, a portly gentleman in a golf shirt, addressing him as Mr. Henderson. She chatted warmly with the woman in 3B, complimenting her on her cashmere wrap. She took her time making each of the white passengers feel seen, valued, and catered to. When she passed Amy's seat, however, her eyes slid over her as if 2A were an empty space, an architectural feature of the bulkhead. No greeting, no offer of a drink, nothing. Amy, accustomed to the subtle and not-so-subtle slights that came with being a black woman in overwhelmingly white spaces, initially let it go. She was engrossed in reviewing a complex prospectus on her tablet, her mind 1,000 miles away, deep in the intricacies of nitrogen-fixing bacteria and machine learning algorithms. She would simply ask when Lorraine came back around, but Lorraine didn't come back around. Another flight attendant, a younger, brighter-eyed woman named Jenna, eventually came by. "Ma'am, can I get you something to drink before we take off? Champagne orange juice. Just some water, please." "Thank you," Amy said, giving Jenna a warm, genuine smile. Jenna returned it instantly and hurried off. The moment of slight could have ended there. A minor blip, a misunderstanding, but as the plane pushed back from the gate at Denver International Airport, the pattern began to solidify. After the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 FT, the cabin service began in earnest. Lorraine was at the helm, commanding the small galley with an air of unassailable authority. She began taking drink and meal orders, starting, as was customary, from the front of the cabin. She engaged Mr. Henderson in a lengthy conversation about his wine selection. She offered the woman in the cashmere wrap an extra pillow. She took the order of the man across the aisle from Amy, and then once again she glided past seat 2A, without a word, her gaze fixed on the passenger in row 3. This time it was impossible to ignore. It was a deliberate, calculated act of erasure. Amy felt a familiar cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was the exhaustion of having to constantly prove her belonging, of having to assert her own existence in spaces where her credentials and her currency should have made itself evident. She waited a moment, took a slow, deep breath to steady her nerves, and pressed the call button. A few moments later, Lorraine appeared. The plastic smile was gone, replaced by a look of undisguised annoyance. "Yes," the word was clipped. "Hello," Amy began, her voice even and calm. "I believe you may have missed me during the service. I'd like a cup of black coffee, please." Lorraine stared at her for a beat too long. A flicker of something disdain perhaps crossed her face, before being smoothed over with a veneer of professional indifference. "I'll get to it when I'm finished with the other passengers." The dismissal was as sharp as a slap. Amy watched as Lorraine turned on her heel and proceeded to serve the passenger behind her, then the one behind that. Minutes stretched into an uncomfortable eternity. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the cabin. Every other passenger had been served. Trays were being laid and silverware clinked. Amy sat a statue of patience, her gaze fixed on Lorraine. She wasn't just a CEO, she was a scientist. She observed. She collected data. She identified patterns, and the pattern here was undeniable. Finally, with the rest of the cabin settled, Lorraine returned to the galley, busying herself with rearranging napkins. She made no move to get the coffee. Amy pressed the call button again. The light pinged an electronic summons in the quiet cabin. Lorraine ignored it. Amy pressed it again, holding it down for 3 full seconds. The chime was more insistent this time. Several passengers glanced over. Lorraine emerged from the galley, her face a thunderous mask. She marched to Amy's seat, her movements stiff with anger. "I am very busy, as you can see." She hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "You will have to wait your turn." Amy looked at the fully served cabin. She looked at the empty hands of the other flight attendants, who were now standing idly. She looked back at Lorraine's furious eyes. "My turn for what?" Amy asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Everyone else has been served. I have made a simple, polite request for a cup of coffee twice now. Your colleague Jenna was perfectly lovely earlier, but you have gone out of your way to ignore me since I stepped on this plane. So let me ask you directly. Is there a reason you are refusing to serve me?" The directness of the question seemed to stun Lorraine. Her face flushed a blotchy red. "We reserve the right to refuse service to disruptive passengers," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. The absurdity of the statement hung in the air. Amy hadn't moved. She hadn't raised her voice. She had done nothing but exist in her seat. "Disruptive?" Amy repeated, a single eyebrow arching by asking for coffee. "Or is my presence in this seat what you find disruptive?" The accusation, now unveiled and shimmering in the cabin air, was undeniable. The man in 1C, Mr. Henderson, lowered his newspaper. The woman in 3B paused with a fork halfway to her mouth. They were no longer just passengers. They were an audience. Lorraine, cornered and exposed, made a fatal mistake. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, condescending tone. "Listen, honey," she began, the word dripping with false familiarity. "Maybe you're not used to how things work up here. This cabin is for our premier guests. Sometimes people get upgraded by mistake. If you just sit tight and keep quiet, nobody has to make a fuss." It was the final, unforgivable piece of data. Lorraine hadn't just ignored her. She had constructed an entire narrative in her head to justify it. A narrative in which a black woman, regardless of her elegant suit or her poised demeanor, could not possibly belong in first class unless it was by accident. She wasn't a CEO. She wasn't a valued customer. She was a mistake, an error to be managed. Amy felt the cold knot in her stomach dissolve, replaced by a wave of pure crystalline clarity. The exhaustion vanished. The frustration evaporated. In its place was a singular, unshakable resolve. This was no longer about a cup of coffee. This was about the fundamental principle of dignity. She looked Lorraine directly in the eye. Her voice when she spoke was not loud, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "Lorraine," she said deliberately, using her name, "you have made 2 critical errors. First, you assumed you knew who I was. You don't. Second, and far more importantly, you assumed I would tolerate your bigotry. I won't." Amy picked up her phone. "You are creating a hostile and unsafe environment. I'm going to need to speak with the captain immediately." Lorraine scoffed a brittle, ugly sound. "The captain is busy flying the plane. He doesn't have time for your little tantrums." "He'll make time," Amy said, her fingers already navigating to the airline's corporate contact page. "And I assure you, what's coming isn't a tantrum. It's a reckoning." She looked past Lorraine to the younger flight attendant, Jenna, who was watching the scene unfold with wide, horrified eyes. "Jenna," Amy said, her tone shifting to one of command. "Please inform Captain Macmillan that a passenger in seat 2A needs to report a safety concern regarding the conduct of his cabin crew. Tell him it's urgent. The word safety was a key. It was a trigger in the world of aviation. It bypassed customer service complaints and went straight to the cockpit. Jenna, pale and trembling, simply nodded and skewered toward the front of the plane, leaving Lorraine standing alone in the aisle, her face a picture of disbelief and dawning horror. The plane was still flying, but Dr. Amy Thornton had just seized control. The cockpit door of a commercial airliner is a sacred barrier. For a pilot to open it mid-flight for a passenger issue is rare. For them to emerge and address the cabin is an event of significance. When Captain David McMillan appeared, he radiated an aura of calm authority. He was a man in his late 40s with a neatly trimmed beard and the focused, steady eyes of someone who spends his life making critical decisions based on limited data. He approached seat 2A, his gaze sweeping the scene. Amy poised and resolute. Lorraine standing stiffly nearby, her face a mask of defiant indignation. The other first-class passengers all pretending not to watch but missing nothing. "Ma'am, I'm Captain McMillan," he said, his voice a low baritone designed to de-escalate. "My first officer informed me you had a safety concern." Amy met his gaze directly. "Thank you for coming, Captain. I do. My concern is with the fitness for duty of your senior flight attendant, Lorraine Walsh." The captain's eyebrows rose slightly. Fitness for duty. This was specific operational language, not the usual passenger complaint. "That's correct." Amy continued, her tone as precise as a legal brief. "Since boarding, Ms. Walsh has engaged in a consistent and targeted pattern of discriminatory behavior. She has repeatedly and deliberately refused me service while attending to every other passenger in this cabin. When I finally addressed the issue with her, she responded not with an apology, but with condescension, hostility, and a baseless accusation that I was being disruptive. She then made an insinuation that I did not belong in this cabin." She paused, letting the words land. "Captain, a flight attendant's primary responsibility is the safety and well-being of all passengers. An individual who is so clouded by personal prejudice that she cannot perform her basic duties for every passenger under her care is by definition a liability. Her judgment is compromised. In the event of a real emergency, I have zero confidence that she would be able to assist me or any other passenger she deems unworthy. Her behavior is not just insulting, it is unprofessional, erratic, and it creates an unsafe environment. Therefore, I must insist that this issue is addressed before we proceed." Captain McMillan listened intently, his expression unreadable. He turned to Lorraine. "Ms. Walsh, what is your response to this allegation?" Lorraine, seeing the captain as her ally, let her victimhood narrative pour out. "Captain, this woman has been difficult from the moment she got on. She's been demanding and aggressive. I was simply trying to complete my service in an orderly fashion, and she became belligerent. She's twisting everything I've been with this airline for 30 years. I would never." "So, you deny refusing her service?" the captain interrupted, cutting through the hysterics. "I didn't refuse. I told her I would get to her when I could," Lorraine insisted. Amy interjected calmly. "Captain, you can very easily verify my account. Your other flight attendant, Jenna, witnessed the entire exchange, as did Mr. Henderson in 1C and Mrs. Gable in 3B. I'm sure they can confirm that I have been nothing but quiet and patient until my repeated polite requests were met with open hostility." All eyes, including the captain's, subtly shifted to the other passengers. Mr. Henderson gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Mrs. Gable looked down at her lap, but her flushed cheeks told a story of their own. The collective unspoken testimony was damning. Captain McMillan's face hardened. He was a pilot, not a social worker, but he was a master of risk assessment. He had a volatile crew member, a credible and exceptionally articulate passenger making a serious claim, and a cabin full of witnesses. Continuing the flight under these conditions was a risk. The tension was a palpable entity in the cabin. "Lorraine," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "Go to the rear galley. Stay there. Jenna, you will handle the first-class cabin for the remainder of the flight." Lorraine looked as if he had physically struck her. "What?" "Captain, you can't be serious. You're taking her side." I am not taking a side. Miss Walsh, McMillan corrected her, his voice dropping to an icy calm. I am managing my crew and ensuring the safety of this flight. You have become the center of a major disruption. Now go to the rear galley. That's a direct order. Defeated, humiliated, and seething with a rage that seemed to vibrate off her, Lorraine turned and stalked down the aisle, bumping the shoulder of a passenger in the economy cabin as she went. The captain turned back to Amy. Ma'am, I apologize for the conduct of my crew member. Please rest assured it will be dealt with. Can I get you that coffee now? He had hoped that would be the end of it. A small victory for the passenger, a reprimand for the flight attendant, and the flight could continue to New York. He had underestimated Dr. Amy Thornton. No thank you, Captain, Amy said, her voice unwavering, and I'm afraid this is not over. You've addressed the immediate symptom, but not the root cause. You have a crew member who has demonstrated a clear inability to perform her duties professionally. Removing her to the back of the plane doesn't solve the problem. It just hides it for a few hours. This isn't about me getting a coffee. This is about ensuring that no other passenger is subjected to this kind of treatment. It's also about corporate accountability. She held up her phone where she had already drafted an email. As a CEO myself, I understand the importance of protocols. What happens when we land? Will Ms. Walsh simply move on to her next flight and do this to someone else? Someone who might not have the confidence or the resources to challenge her. The captain was taken aback. Ma'am, there will be a full report filed. Our corporate office will investigate. A report is not enough, Amy stated flatly. I have lost all faith in the professionalism and safety of this cabin crew. The trust between passenger and crew has been irrevocably broken. As a fare-paying passenger in your care, I am officially stating that I do not feel safe continuing this journey under these circumstances. She took a breath and delivered the final decisive blow. I am the CEO of Origin Innovations. We hold the platinum corporate account with transcontinental spending upwards of $20 million a year on travel for our executives and scientists. My executive assistant is on standby. When we land, I will be making a formal complaint, not just as an individual, but as one of your largest corporate clients. However, I am not willing to wait until we land in New York. The integrity of this flight has been compromised. Now, the mention of the corporate account, the specific dollar amount, was like a lightning strike in the cabin. The captain's professional demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second. This wasn't just an angry passenger anymore. This was a high-stakes business problem. What exactly are you asking for, Dr. Thornton? He asked, using her title for the first time. I'm not asking for anything, Amy replied. I'm stating a position. I no longer consent to being a passenger on this flight. Federal Aviation Administration regulations are quite clear about a captain's authority in situations involving passenger disputes and crew integrity. You have a choice. You can proceed to New York with a passenger who has declared she feels unsafe, and a compromised crew member, and deal with the monumental legal and corporate fallout that will ensue. Or you can acknowledge the severity of this situation and return to the gate. She leaned forward slightly. You are the pilot in command. The decision is yours. But I want it on the record right here, right now, with these witnesses, that I have formally requested to be let off this aircraft at the nearest possible opportunity due to a credible safety concern. I believe the nearest opportunity is Denver International Airport. She had grounded the plane, not by force, not by hysterics, but by a calm, logical, and legally sound dismantling of the captain's options. She had cornered him with procedure and liability. Continuing the flight now would be his own personal gamble, a willful disregard of a passenger's stated safety concern. Captain McMillan stood there for a long moment, the weight of his command pressing down on him. He looked at Amy's unblinking eyes. He looked at the nervous faces of the other passengers. He thought of the mountain of paperwork the National Transportation Safety Board inquiries, the corporate hearings. He thought of the phrase, "A passenger has formally requested to be let off the aircraft." He made the only choice a seasoned pilot could make, the choice that minimized risk. He keyed his radio. His voice, broadcast throughout the entire cabin, was heavy with resignation. Denver Tower, this is Transcontinental 417. We have a cabin safety issue and will need to return to the gate. Declaring pan-pan. A collective gasp went through the aircraft. Pan, the international signal for an urgent situation that falls short of a full-blown mayday. The plane began a slow, graceful bank, turning back toward Denver. Amy Thornton sat back in her seat. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't created a scene. She had simply refused to be erased, and in doing so, she had done the unthinkable. She had turned the plane around. The real turbulence was just beginning. The return to gate B-52 was surreal. Passengers who had been settling in for a cross-country flight now peered out the windows at the familiar tarmac they had just left. A low murmur rippled through the economy cabin as flight attendants offered vague, sanitized explanations about an unforeseen cabin issue. But in first class, the silence was thick with tension. As the jet bridge reconnected with a dull thud, Captain McMillan's voice came over the intercom again, this time addressing only the first-class cabin. Dr. Thornton, a gate agent, and a corporate representative will be meeting you as you deplane. He then switched to the all-cabin address. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We ask that you all remain seated while we resolve this situation. Amy gathered her briefcase and her coat, her movements deliberate and unhurried. As she stood, Mr. Henderson from 1C caught her eye. He was a senior partner at a major Denver law firm, a man used to assessing situations quickly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but clear, "that was the most professionally executed maneuver I've ever witnessed. If you need a witness, you have my card." He slid a thick embossed business card into her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." "I appreciate that," Amy said, accepting it. As she walked toward the open door, she passed Lorraine, who had been summoned from the rear galley. The flight attendant stood near the cockpit, her face pale, her eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and fear. She refused to look at Amy, staring instead at a fixed point on the bulkhead, as if trying to will the entire situation out of existence. Waiting on the jet bridge were two people, a flustered-looking gate agent in a transcontinental uniform, and a man in a rumpled suit who introduced himself as Neil Perry, the station's duty manager. Perry had the harried look of someone whose quiet Tuesday had just been torpedoed. "Dr. Thornton," he began his tone, attempting a placating smoothness. "I'm Neil Perry. I understand there was some misunderstanding on board. We deeply apologize for any inconvenience. We can get you booked on the next flight to LaGuardia, which leaves in 90 minutes. Of course, we'll ensure your comfort in our flagship lounge until then." He was treating it like a missed connection, a problem to be solved with a new ticket and a complimentary glass of wine. Amy gave him a cool, appraising look. "Mr. Perry," she said, her voice leaving no room for misunderstanding, "let's be very clear. This was not a misunderstanding. This was an incident of targeted harassment and discrimination by a member of your crew. This plane did not return to the gate because of an inconvenience. It returned because I, a passenger, declared a safety issue stemming from the hostile and unprofessional conduct of flight attendant Lorraine Walsh. So no, I will not be getting on the next flight. I will not be flying transcontinental at all today." Perry's face fell. This was not going to be an easy fix. "Secondly," Amy continued, "I will require the full names and employee identification numbers of the entire flight crew. Captain David McMillan, First Officer Robert Peterson, and flight attendants Lorraine Walsh and Jenna." "I'm sorry I didn't get Jenna's last name. I'm not sure I'm authorized to provide that," Perry stammered. "You can either provide it to me now, or you can provide it to my legal team in a few hours." "The choice is yours," Amy said calmly. "I will also need a written incident report from you as the ranking airline official on site, detailing the reason Flight 417 returned to the gate." Behind them, the cockpit door opened. Captain McMillan stepped out, followed by the young flight attendant, Jenna. The captain handed a clipboard to Perry. "Neil, here's my preliminary report. I need you to get statements from the crew and the relevant passengers." He then looked at Amy. "Dr. Thornton, for the record, the other flight attendant is Jenna Kowalski, and for what it's worth, you handled yourself with remarkable composure. Professionalism should be the standard for everyone." "Captain, not a remarkable exception," she replied, though her tone held a note of acknowledgement for his own difficult position. Jenna looked at Amy, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and admiration. Ma'am, Dr. Thornton, I am so sorry for what happened. What she did was wrong. Everyone saw it. Thank you, Jenna. It takes courage to say that, Amy said, giving the young woman a brief, reassuring nod. The station manager, Perry, looked like a man caught in a crossfire. He was desperately trying to de-escalate to contain the problem within the confines of the airport. But Amy was already thinking several moves ahead. She took out her phone, stepped to the side of the jet bridge traffic, and made a call. Brenda, she said, her voice now warm and familiar. It's Amy. I've had an incident on a flight out of Denver. I won't be making the New York meeting. No, I'm fine, but I need you to do a few things. First, cancel my return ticket on Transcontinental. Cancel all upcoming bookings for me on that airline. Second, I want you to draft a letter to Edward Coleman. Edward Coleman was the CEO of Transcontinental Airlines. Inform Mr. Coleman's office that, as of today, Origin Innovations is suspending its $20 million corporate travel account with his airline effective immediately pending a full and satisfactory resolution to this matter. Reference Transcontinental Flight 41 and scene. They'll know what it's about. And finally, get me the number for Catherine Webb at Dalton Webb and Finch. Dalton Webb and Finch was one of the most powerful corporate litigation firms in the country. Catherine Webb was a legend, a shark who smelled blood in the water from miles away. Perry, who had overheard the call, went visibly pale. This was no longer a station-level issue. This was a multi-million-dollar corporate crisis that had just been activated by a few calm sentences on a cell phone. The ripple effects were spreading. Meanwhile, back on the aircraft, chaos was brewing. The D-plane crew, Lorraine, Jenna, and the two pilots were being escorted to an operations office. Lorraine was protesting loudly, claiming she was the victim of a coordinated attack. She targeted me. She was looking for a payout. This is what they do, she cried to anyone who would listen, her voice shrill. Jenna, sequestered in a separate room, gave a quiet, tearful, but firm statement to Neil Perry that corroborated every detail of Amy's account. Captain McMillan and his first officer gave dry factual reports, sticking strictly to the timeline of events and regulations. But the subtext was clear. Lorraine Walsh had been the catalyst. Amy, having made her calls, turned back to Perry. Mr. Perry, my car will be here in 15 minutes. I trust you will have that information for me by then. She didn't wait for an answer. She walked away from the gate, her posture erect, her stride confident. She left behind a grounded airplane, a shattered flight crew, a terrified station manager, and the beginnings of a corporate firestorm. She hadn't gotten her coffee, but she had set in motion something far more significant. She had demanded accountability, and the bill was about to come due. Within hours, the incident on Flight 417 had escalated from an operational headache to a full-blown code red crisis at Transcontinental's Chicago headquarters. An email from the CEO of a platinum-level corporate client suspending a $20 million account gets attention faster than a smoke alarm in a server room. Edward Coleman, the CEO of Transcontinental, was a bottom-line man. He was furious, not necessarily at the injustice, but at the catastrophic failure of his customer service. A simple coffee request turns into a grounded plane and a suspended 8-figure account. He roared at his executive committee. How is that possible? I want this investigated and fixed now. The task fell to Gregory Adler, the Senior Vice President of Human Resources. Adler was a company man through and through, a veteran of countless internal disputes. His primary directive always was to protect the company. This meant minimizing liability, controlling the narrative, and whenever possible, finding a way to blame anyone but the airline. Adler's initial review of the reports set off alarm bells. A highly credible, high-value passenger versus a 30-year veteran flight attendant. His instinct was to protect the employee, to shield the company from an admission of systemic failure. A rogue employee was one thing. Admitting to a culture that allowed discrimination was another, far more expensive problem. He summoned Lorraine Walsh to Chicago for a formal interview. Lorraine, coached by her union representative, walked into Adler's office ready for battle. She had spent the last 48 hours crafting a compelling narrative of her own victimhood. She was no longer the aggressor. She was the long-suffering professional assaulted by a new breed of entitled, aggressive passenger looking for a quick payday. Mr. Adler, she began, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I've given 30 years of my life to this airline. 30 years. I've served celebrities, politicians, even royalty. Never in all my time have I been treated the way Dr. Thornton treated me. She spun a tale of veiled threats and a demanding attitude from Amy, starting from the moment of boarding. She had this air about her, Lorraine said, her voice trembling with manufactured sincerity. She was dismissive, arrogant. When I didn't rush to her side the second she pressed the call button, she became hostile. She twisted my words. She accused me of these horrible things. It was a setup. I could feel it. She was baiting me, recording me. I'm sure of it. Gregory Adler listened, nodding sympathetically. This was a version of events he could work with. It painted the passenger as the problem, the instigator, and her grounding the plane, Adler prodded. Tell me about that. It was a power play, Lorraine said, her voice dripping with indignation. The moment she mentioned her corporate account, it all became clear. This was extortion. She was using her position to bully me, to bully the captain to get something for free. It's a form of corporate terrorism is what it is. Adler latched onto the narrative. So, in your professional opinion, she was never in any distress. Her claims of feeling unsafe were a tactic. Absolutely, Lorraine confirmed. It was a performance, and the captain, he was young, he got scared. He folded under pressure instead of standing by his crew. Adler's course was set. The official strategy would be to quietly discredit Dr. for Amy Thornton. He commissioned an internal report that heavily favored Lorraine's version of events. He cherry-picked phrases from the captain's report, focusing on the lack of any physical altercation. He downplayed Jenna Kowalski's testimony as that of a junior, impressionable employee who was intimidated by the high-profile passenger. The first move was a carefully worded letter from Transcontinental's legal department to Catherine Webb, Amy's lawyer. The letter was a masterpiece of corporate deflection. It expressed regret for the miscommunication on Flight 417, but firmly rejected any allegations of discrimination. It painted Dr. Thornton as an agitated passenger whose escalating demands led to the captain making a procedural decision to return to the gate to de-escalate the situation. The letter subtly implied that Dr. Thornton's actions, not Lorraine's, were the root cause of the disruption. It concluded with a low ball offer, a few thousand in travel vouchers, and a reinstatement of the corporate account's discount should they choose to return. Catherine Webb read the letter and laughed out loud in her office. Amateurs, she muttered. She immediately forwarded it to Amy. Amy read it not with anger, but with a chilling sense of disappointment. So this is their play, she said to Catherine over the phone. They're going to try and paint me as the angry black woman. A classic, if pathetic, strategy. They're protecting their employee and betting I'll just go away. It's more than that, Catherine replied, her voice sharp. They're building a defense. They're creating a paper trail to show they took it seriously, investigated, and found their employee blameless. They're preparing for a lawsuit. What they don't know is so are we. But Transcontinental strategy went beyond a letter. A whisper campaign began. Anonymous sources, likely from Adler's department, started leaking a sanitized pro-airline version of the story to aviation bloggers and industry forums. The narrative was always the same. A difficult VIP passenger caused a flight to turn around over a trivial service complaint. No mention of race, no mention of the specific insults, just the image of an entitled CEO throwing her weight around. Amy started to feel the pressure. A colleague from another tech company called her. Amy, what's this I'm hearing about you on that flight? A friend of mine at Transcontinental said you had a flight attendant in tears. It was insidious. It was an attack on her reputation, an attempt to reframe her righteous stand as a moment of entitled rage. For a moment, the sheer injustice of it almost overwhelmed her. They were not only refusing to acknowledge the wrong, they were actively trying to punish her for exposing it. But Gregory Adler and Lorraine Walsh had made the same critical mistake Lorraine had made on the plane. They profoundly underestimated Amy Thornton. They thought she was just a wealthy executive. They didn't understand she was a scientist who dealt in data, a CEO who understood strategy, and a woman who would not be bullied into silence. Catherine Amy said, her voice as cold and hard as steel. They want to fight. Fine. Forget the settlement talks. I don't want an apology anymore. I want a transformation. Let's start digging. I want to know everything there is to know about Lorraine Walsh. I want to know everything about Gregory Adler's history in HR. I want to know about every discrimination complaint filed against this airline for the past 10 years. They think this is about one flight. I'm going to make it about their entire rotten culture. The battle lines were drawn. Transcontinental had chosen to protect its own and smear a victim. They had no idea they weren't just fighting a lawsuit. They were fighting a war against an opponent with limitless resources and an unshakable conviction. And the first casualty of that war was going to be the truth they were so desperately trying to hide. Amy Thornton didn't build a billion-dollar company by backing down from a fight. While Transcontinental's HR department was busy building a fortress of lies, Amy and her legal powerhouse, Catherine Webb, were assembling an army. They want to play dirty. "We'll play smart," Catherine said during a strategy call. "Corporate malfeasance is like an iceberg. The incident they're focused on is just the tiny piece sticking out of the water. Our job is to show the judge and the public the massive, dangerous structure lurking beneath. The first step was to formalize the witness accounts." Catherine's team flew to Denver and took a formal videotape deposition from Mr. Henderson, the lawyer in seat 1C. His testimony was devastatingly precise. He recounted Lorraine's overtly dismissive and contemptuous attitude toward Dr. Thornton, contrasting it with her fawning behavior toward other passengers. He used phrases like a clear and unmistakable racial animus. Coming from a senior partner at a prestigious law firm, his words carried immense weight. The next and more crucial step was to secure the cooperation of Jenna Kowalski. The young flight attendant was terrified. She had been warned by her union rep to stick to a vague, non-committal story. She was being pressured by older colleagues loyal to Lorraine. Her career was on the line. Amy decided to handle this herself. She didn't send a lawyer. She requested a private meeting with Jenna at a quiet coffee shop far from the airport. Jenna arrived looking nervous and drawn. "Dr. Thornton," she began, "I don't know if I can do this. They'll fire me. My life will be ruined." Amy looked at her, not with pressure, but with empathy. "Jenna, I'm not going to ask you to do anything that you're not comfortable with. But I want to tell you why I'm pursuing this. This isn't about money for me. This is about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to the next person and the person after that. People like Lorraine and the managers like Gregory Adler who protect them. They count on the silence of good people like you. They create a culture of fear, and that fear allows them to keep doing what they're doing." Amy leaned in slightly. "You told me what she did was wrong. You saw it. You know it. The question you have to ask yourself is not what will happen if you speak up, but what will it feel like 5 years from now if you don't? When you see something like this happen again and you know you had a chance to stop it." She then laid a card on the table. "My legal team is one of the best in the country. They are prepared to offer you full whistleblower protection and legal representation free of charge. Furthermore, I will personally guarantee you a position within my company's corporate logistics department at a higher salary than you make now, starting tomorrow if you need it. You will not be unemployed. You will not be ruined. You will be protected." It was an extraordinary offer. It removed the fear. It replaced the risk with security. Tears welled in Jenna's eyes. It was the lifeline she didn't even know she could hope for. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll tell them everything." With Jenna's cooperation, the floodgates opened. She provided Catherine Webb's investigators with a treasure trove of inside information. She detailed a long-standing culture of cronyism and prejudice among a clique of senior flight attendants with Lorraine Walsh as its queen bee. She described how they would trade favorable routes, mock passengers in the galley, and use internal reporting systems to cover for each other's mistakes. Most critically, Jenna recalled specific incidents. "Lorraine. She has a thing about upgrades," Jenna explained. "She believes she can spot who deserves to be in first class. She's particularly nasty to people of color who get upgraded. She calls them seat fillers. She'll give them the worst service. Forget their meal choice. The incident with you, Dr. Thornton, was the most blatant I've ever seen, but the behavior itself wasn't new." Armed with this, Catherine's team filed a massive discovery motion in court demanding access to Lorraine Walsh's complete employment file, including all passenger complaints and Gregory Adler's records on handling such complaints. Transcontinental's lawyers fought back, citing privacy and undue burden. But the judge swayed by the depositions from Henderson, and Jenna granted the motion. It was a huge victory. The files arrived in dozens of sealed boxes at Catherine Webb's firm. A team of paralegals began the painstaking work of sifting through 30 years of data. For weeks, they found nothing but minor, unsubstantiated complaints, all dismissed by Adler with boilerplate language. It seemed like a dead end. "They've scrubbed the records," a junior associate said in frustration. "No," Catherine said, staring at the wall of boxes. "They haven't scrubbed them. They've just buried the truth under mountains of irrelevant paper. Keep digging. We're looking for a pattern, a name, anything that connects." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. It wasn't in a passenger complaint. It was in the expense reports. A sharp-eyed forensic accountant on Catherine's team noticed an anomaly in Lorraine's meal and lodging expenses on certain international layovers, specifically in Lisbon and Rio de Janeiro. The receipts were from high-end luxury hotels and Michelin-starred restaurants far exceeding the standard crew allowance, but they had all been approved, signed off by a mid-level manager in the finance department. Why would Adler's HR department include financial records in a file about personnel conduct? Catherine mused. Unless they didn't know what they were handing over. She tasked an investigator with a simple job. Find out who that finance manager was. The investigator came back a day later. The manager's name was Martin Walsh. He was Lorraine Walsh's ex-husband. They had divorced acrimoniously 5 years ago. "Get him on the phone," Catherine ordered. The investigator found Martin Walsh, now retired and living in Florida. At first, he was reluctant to talk, but when the investigator mentioned Lorraine, a dam of resentment broke. "Lorraine," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "She thinks she's untouchable, thinks the rules don't apply to her. She's been running her own little scam at Transcontinental for years." "What kind of scam, Mr. Walsh?" the investigator asked. "It wasn't just my signing off on her expenses," he confessed, eager to unburden himself. "That was just to keep the peace at home. The real game was with the cargo. She had a side deal with an art and antique dealer in Lisbon. Small, high-value items, icons, jewelry, rare books. They weren't declared. They were packed in a custom-made suitcase that she would list as crew baggage, which gets a much less thorough inspection. She'd walk right through customs. A friend in the ground crew would ensure her bag was never flagged. She was a high-end smuggler using her uniform as a cloak of invisibility. She made a fortune. The investigator could barely contain his excitement. "Can you prove this?" "I have copies of bank statements," Martin said, his voice full of spite. "Statements for an account she didn't think I knew about. I kept them for a rainy day. I'd say a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against my dear ex-wife qualifies as a storm. Wouldn't you?" This was it. The karma. The hard, devastating karma. It was bigger and dirtier than anyone could have imagined. Amy's stand against racism had inadvertently hooked a fish so large it was about to pull the entire transcontinental fishing boat under. Catherine Webb hung up the phone after her investigator's report, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Gregory Adler," she said to the empty room, "you thought you were fighting a discrimination case. You're about to get hit with a federal crime." The counteroffensive was complete. They weren't just going to win, they were going to obliterate. The evidence extracted from Lorraine's embittered ex-husband was the key that unlocked a far darker story than anyone imagined. This wasn't just about expense reports. It was a confession detailing a sophisticated smuggling operation. For years, Lorraine had used her uniform as a cloak of invisibility, trafficking undeclared antiques in her crew baggage, assisted by a contact in the ground crew. The discovery transformed the case. What began as a stand against racism had inadvertently exposed a federal crime. Catherine Webb's first call was not to Transcontinental, but to the Department of Justice. A civil lawsuit was now a secondary concern. She was holding a lit stick of dynamite. Her next move was theatrical. She requested a face-to-face meeting with Transcontinental's CEO, Edward Coleman, pointedly excluding Gregory Adler, the HR vice president who had orchestrated the cover-up. Intrigued and alarmed, Coleman agreed. In a sterile Chicago boardroom, Coleman and his chief counsel faced Amy and Catherine. "Mr. Coleman," Catherine began dispensing with pleasantries, "we're here because your HR department, under Mr. Adler's direction, responded to my client's legitimate complaint by trying to discredit her. They assumed they could manage a simple discrimination claim. They were mistaken. She slid a single folder across the vast mahogany table. That is a copy of the file we delivered to the Department of Justice yesterday. Coleman's lawyer opened it. His professional composure vanished, replaced by a pallor of shock. He pushed the folder to his CEO, whose face cycled from confusion to disbelief to a deep burning crimson. "This is absurd," Coleman stammered, but the words lacked force. "Is it?" Catherine countered, her voice like ice. "We have sworn testimony. We have offshore bank records that correlate with Lorraine Walsh's flight schedule. We have the name of her accomplice in your ground crew. The DOJ finds it quite credible. They are obtaining warrants as we speak." She let the devastating reality sink in. Your senior VP of HR was so focused on burying a complaint of racism that he failed to conduct any real due diligence on the employee he was protecting. She continued, "His negligence allowed a criminal enterprise to fester within your airline. He didn't just fail my client. He failed this entire company. He has exposed Transcontinental to a federal investigation and a public relations nightmare that will make this lawsuit look like a rounding error." Amy spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but powerful. "Mr. Coleman, I told your captain this was about accountability. When your company chose to protect a bigot, you unknowingly chose to protect a felon. This is the culture Mr. Adler fostered." Coleman was broken. The risk he now faced was existential. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Want?" Catherine replied. "We're past that. Here is what is going to happen. You will terminate Gregory Adler for gross negligence. You will commission a truly independent outside counsel approved by us to overhaul your HR department. You will issue a full public apology to Dr. Thornton acknowledging the discrimination. You will fund a new mandatory anti-bias training program called the Thornton Initiative. And finally, you will settle with my client for damages. The number is 8 figures and it is not negotiable. It was total unconditional surrender." Coleman looked at his lawyer, who gave a single-minute shake of his head. They had no choice. "Agreed?" Coleman said the word tasting like ash. The karma was swift and brutal. 2 days later, federal agents raided Lorraine Walsh's home at dawn, finding several undeclared antiques. Her accomplice was arrested at JFK that same afternoon. The news of a smuggling ring operating within Transcontinental exploded across the media. That afternoon, Gregory Adler was summoned to the CEO's office. He walked in expecting a strategy session and was met by security. He was informed of his immediate termination and escorted from the building with his belongings in a box, a public casualty of the rot he tried to hide. The unraveling was complete. For Lorraine, the woman who refused a cup of coffee, her world of entitlement and crime was obliterated. For Adler, the man who chose lies over truth, his career was vaporized. Their downfall was a direct consequence of the very prejudice they defended. The initial act of bigotry was the loose thread that, when pulled by a woman who refused to be erased, caused their entire rotten tapestry to come undone. In the end, this was never just a story about a flight. It was about the corrosive nature of prejudice and the incredible power of a single principled stand. Dr. Amy Thornton didn't just ground a plane. She grounded an entire culture of impunity. The public apology from Transcontinental was unprecedented in its honesty. The Thornton Initiative became a new industry standard for employee training, transforming the airline from a cautionary tale into a model for change. The settlement money seeded a foundation that has since helped hundreds of young women of color pursue careers in STEM and aviation, creating a legacy of opportunity from an incident of hate. Jenna Kowalski, protected and empowered, was promoted and became a lead trainer for the new initiative, teaching new hires the importance of courage and integrity. And Lorraine Walsh. She was convicted on multiple federal charges and served 4 years in prison. A stark reminder that karma, when it finally arrives, often brings its own set of ironclad regulations. This story shows us that sometimes the most profound changes don't begin in a boardroom, but with one person in one seat who simply refuses to be invisible. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of justice and dramatic karma. Your support helps us continue to tell these important tales. Until next time, Stand tall and never be afraid to speak your truth.